Uh, Thank you, everyone, for coming. We've got some great panelists. I'll let them introduce themselves in a second. But so this morning we're going to be talking about the global cybersecurity landscape. One thing is we've noticed is that there has been a lot of laws passed, regulations passed out there that are impacting companies. So what we want to do today is provide you with an overview of some of the more impactful ones. And also talk about like what how companies are reacting, and more importantly, like what you should be doing, right? With that, I'll let maybe Josh start with an introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Silverstein. I'm a counsel at Skadden, a global law firm, and one of the leaders of our cybersecurity and data privacy practice. I've spent most of my law practice in and out of government. I've worked at the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and most recently at the Department of Homeland Security on the team helping to write the CERCIA rule, which, as recent news suggests, is about to be completely rewritten. But it's an really exciting legal practice and an exciting time to be in it. Kaylee?
Hi, I'm Kaylee Bankston. I'm a partner at Morrison Foerster in our cybersecurity and privacy group. I've spent my career in private practice advising companies on all things related to privacy and cyber, and I'm also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center.
And I'm David Wong. I'm a director at Google. I've been with Mandiant for about 12 years now. I lead the consulting team that does incident response, offensive security testing, and strategic security. And I don't know why, but I spend a lot of time with lawyers. It's a very litigious world.
Unfortunately for you.
It seems. So with that, let me start with question for either of you. What are some of the more impactful recent regulations out there?
Sure. I don't want to do alphabet soup. So, I'll give one example, which is the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. So, if anyone knows who's ever been in touch with their lawyers after an incident, there is no cross-sectoral reporting regime in the United States. It's very different from Europe. And this law passed in 2022 in the Biden administration was the first effort to build that, right? To build a national security-focused incident reporting regime with reports coming from across the 16 critical infrastructure sectors to CISA. If you've spoken to your lawyers recently, you know you still don't have to do that. And that is because the effort to establish an actual rule that has meat and guidance for companies is still pending. And I think that is, in some way, the story of US cyber, at least incident reporting regulation today, is an immense amount of work, an immense amount of talk, but despite some developments, we still do not have anywhere near the level of regulatory compliance burdens that companies in Europe, and frankly, American companies operating in Europe, are experiencing over the last several years.
Yeah, although that's changing.
Yeah.
And of course, companies still have to deal with the existing state breach notification laws. If you have personal information that's compromised, all 50 states have a different law. I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but they're not consistent. And that's sort of a theme that we see both in the US and abroad with all of these new laws coming online in this space. Is they're not consistent, they're not harmonized, they typically don't preempt one another. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later in the discussion, but we're starting to see a shift both in the US and globally around incident reporting obligations outside the context of personal information. So more focus on things like critical infrastructure, national security impacts, and less concern about privacy personal information. That's all still there, but there are also overlaying frameworks that are now focused more on impacts to critical infrastructure, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today.
Yeah, so actually maybe we could get into that, right? So historically, it has, most of the laws that we've seen, going back 20 years, have been in breach notification. So, some personal information, and each industry defines it a little bit different, right? And it's a patchwork. So the difference you're saying is it's beyond just the data itself, but in certain industries, if it has to do with like critical infrastructure, and you've had an incident, I think we've seen other areas where if you have a ransomware payment, you have to potentially notify. So maybe you guys could get into that a little bit.
I mean, that was one of the big parts of CERCIA. I mean, was not just incident reporting within 72 hours, but ransom payment reporting within 24 hours.
Right.
Again, this has not happened yet, but you've seen across jurisdictions globally repeated efforts to consider banning ransom payments for specific sectors, often the sectors that most need to function. So government sectors, public health, emergency services. Even in the United States, there has been an ongoing dialogue, at least in government circles, for years about whether ransom payments should be banned. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but all it takes is really one sort of the next major ransomware incident that shuts down sort of X critical service for that conversation to bubble up again.
Yeah, and it actually, it's not just limited to federal regulations. And for companies that are subject to the New York Department of Financial Services regulations, they've amended their cybersecurity regulations. They also have some obligations around reporting in connection with ransom payments. So I think the takeaway is that the scope is broadening and becoming less consistent.
Yeah, one thing that's, the inconsistency, I think, creates a challenge, I think, for everyone in this room, because you have to think about, well, under what circumstances and what data, what business I'm in, like what, where the owner of that data, like where do they reside? And then there are all these like crazy timing requirements which I think makes it very complicated, for customers the companies to figure out how to react.
Well, and it's not just where does the data reside, right?
Right.
It's who does the data relate to?
Correct.
I mean, I think 5-6 years ago when Americans were talking about GDPR, it was, okay, there are X number of Europeans and X number of Americans, so the Europeans are the ones who need the GDPR notice.
Yep.
And that's actually not true. It's the analysis of whether an incident, even for something that's been around for as long as GDPR, 2018, is not uncomplicated. And the new regimes that are coming into the fore, I mean, I think about the data security program, the bulk data rule in the United States, are equally complex and challenging for companies to implement. And what's more, there isn't 5-6 years of guidance and enforcement history to guide companies. So we're kind of on the cusp of, for several regulatory regimes, seeing the first real enforcement actions where we're not really sure what they're going to look like because there's no history to go back on.
Yeah, it's a good point. A lot of these regulations are new or on the books, but not yet implemented or enforced. But I think it's important to note the data is still a focus, but it's broader than that. So we're seeing, like in Europe, for example, under NIS2, there's a focus on operational impact to services. So that's a different sort of lens through which we're seeing regulation be applied. That's different from how I think traditionally breach notification has just been about individuals' impact, the personal information that relates to individuals. And now we're seeing this more holistic view of impact to industries more broadly, national security concerns, things like that.
What do you do when you get, conflicting information that tells you to do different things, right? So like the one I'm thinking about is the Digital Services Act. And maybe you could explain what that is, Josh, and then the recent FTC guidance on that.
Well, I mean, I'll start with the FTC guidance because I think it's an interesting story, right? So 7 years ago, I remember advising U.S. telecommunications firms on how to explain Executive Order 12333 and FISA Section 702 to European DPAs. The pressure was coming from Europe, and the American government was largely supporting private sector in handling that pressure. I remember guidance being issued by the intelligence community to explain what these laws were, right? We were in a defensive position. And I think now that has shifted. And I think companies are stuck in the middle between two parties now that are both going on the offensive. And I think the FTC letters that you're referring to is exactly that. So several weeks ago, the chairman of the FTC issued letters to about 24 technology firms in the United States saying, in effect, hey, by the way, weakening encryption, complying with censorship requests that impact American speech, we think that that could be a violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act. That could be unreasonable or it could be deceptive. So it put American companies on notice that some of the things they need to do to comply with the Digital Services Act, to comply with its counterpart in the UK, the Online Privacy Act, is one of those. There are so many new ones, honestly. Could put you in legal jeopardy in the United States. So I do think companies are genuinely in between a rock and a hard place, and the only answer to that is documenting your approach, right? Documenting your approach, getting it blessed, preferably by outside counsel, so that you have some backing, some backup when a regulator, whether it's a US regulator or a European one, comes knocking and wants to talk.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think regulators want to see that companies are trying to do the right thing, that they've thought about the risks, that they're working toward compliance, they're working toward achieving reasonable security. When you think about the inconsistencies just in breach notification, I mean, it's simply not possible to comply with some of these requirements. Some of these laws globally require notification within 1 hour of an incident. I mean, no, you can't even get your team on a phone call in 1 hour. Like it's not realistic. But I think, as like you said, documenting, having a defensible position that you're trying to do the right thing, having a security mindset. It's not just about compliance. It's about actually securing your environment, doing the right thing for your customers. Those are all narratives that you want to create around yourself, as opposed to checking a compliance box. You want to have a bigger story to tell, and I think that will put you in a better position with conversations with regulators.
So yeah, thank you for that. I think you mentioned, Josh, I think the bulk data security rule. So I think that one's been interesting because we've had a lot of clients ask us about that one, right? So maybe Kaylee, you could just start by explaining to the audience what that is.
Yeah, it's pretty significant, and I think it flew under the radar a little bit. So if it's kind of a cross-border transfer rule. That's not exactly what it is, but you can think about it in that way. And in that traditionally the U.S. has not put restrictions on the flow of information from a privacy and security perspective. But what the bulk data transfer rule does, the data security program, I think is what the term they're trying to coin with it, is it prohibits individuals in what are called countries of concern. So those are countries that the U.S. has deemed some sort of national security risk, China being the most impactful and notable under the regulation. And Venezuela is also a tricky one. There's other ones on there like Russia, Iran, but they're typically dealt with in the sanctions context, so they've been less impactful for companies. But they prohibit companies from making certain information accessible, defined very broadly, to individuals located in those countries. And we can talk a little bit more about this. I'll let Josh get into this, but the breadth of the application of the rule is quite broad in terms of the data that it applies to and the companies that it sweeps up, and there's civil and criminal penalties associated with it. So this law is technically on the books. It took effect in April. But a lot of companies were trying to figure out how to comply with it. So the Department of Justice came out and said, okay, we'll give everyone 3 more months, but you better be in compliance in 3 months. That's your grace period. We're going to withhold enforcement for companies that are trying in good faith to come into compliance with this rule. And July has come and gone, and there hasn't been additional guidance from the Department of Justice. So I think we're all hoping and expecting that that's going to come at some point. But to your point earlier, this is a very new regulation, really different framework in terms of U.S. regulation. So there's a lot to be seen in terms of how the Department of Justice is going to interpret and enforce this.
Yeah, and if you want to think about for years, decades, right? The U.S. government has regulated investment in American companies, buying American companies through CFIUS. And the realization over the last decade has been, well, China doesn't need to buy ex-American company if they want to gather intelligence on the U.S. population, on the U.S. military. They can just buy from data brokers. They can buy as much data about Americans as they want legally. And that's really what the bulk data rule, the data security program is about. It's about trying to put some brakes on what has been perceived as essentially a vacuum Hoover outflow of U.S. personal data. And I think Kaylee's point is well taken. We all think about what is PII. It's your name plus X, right? A social, a bank account, a credit card number. This is that plus, right? This is that plus genomic data. It's precise geolocation data. It's a whole, and to be clear, it also includes, government data, and that is both geolocation data for military installations. So there's not, I would say if you ever want bedtime reading to pull out the rule, the last 40 pages of it, I believe, are just a series of coordinates, one after the other of, and those information from those coordinates cannot be sent to countries of concern, to persons of concern, covered persons. And the exceptions there are numerous exceptions, and all we have to understand what they mean and what they cover is what's in the rule. So a good example would be there's an exception for data that is transmitted as part of a sort of covered FDA engagement, right? So think sort of an FDA study. What that means, what that covers, no idea. Absolutely no idea. And it's not as if, there are people like Dave's shop, like other consulting shops who have some insight to share. No one has insight to share because we're all looking at the same documents. We're all talking to the same people at DOJ National Security Division who are not talking. So do we know if there are investigations happening under this program? No, we don't. Is it possible? Yes. Is there a question of whether there are even lawyers at DOJ who haven't been fired who are enforcing this rule? That is an open question. So there's honestly a lot of uncertainty, and to Kaylee's point about criminal and civil penalties, an immense amount of legal risk. And you can bet that there are discussions happening, I would imagine there have to be, about making an example of X company and be really turning the screws on them to show that this law has teeth and that the government's going to enforce it. And we just don't know what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and not to get in the weeds too much, but I think it's important because this is a very impactful regulation. You mentioned data brokers, so there are prohibitions on data brokerage under the rule, but it doesn't stop there. So this law can apply even if you're not a traditional data broker. Essentially, if you have vendors, employees, partners located in a country of concern, and you are a U.S. person, you're potentially subject to the rule. And it's defined very, very broadly. So the potential to access information could potentially bring you within the scope of the rule. And the way it applies is it's called the bulk data rule because there are cascading categories of information from more sensitive to least sensitive. So the more sensitive information, like genomic data, if you process 10,000, if you process 100 on 100 individuals over the course of 12 months, you're potentially within the scope of the rule. Whereas if you collect things like IP addresses, then it's 100,000 over the course of the year. But if you're a large corporation, you can very easily get swept up into that. So I just make that point to explain that it's not a law that only applies to traditional data brokers. It's not a law that applies only if you have offices in countries of concern. It's very, very broad, intentionally so by design. The Department of Justice made that clear. But you're right, we're all kind of in this nascent stages of seeing how it's going to be interpreted and enforced.
Do we know why this rule was created? Was there a specific event that happened?
Yeah.
Or a series of incidents?
It's interesting, particularly in Washington, D.C. It's one of the very, very, very few regulations that has bipartisan support. So the concept kind of originated under the first Trump administration, was carried forward with the Biden administration, and now it looks like the second Trump administration is going to carry it through. But a large driver behind the regulation was this New York Times study that found you can build very, very specific profiles on individual using anonymized information. So you can figure out people's religions, when and where they go to church, what government facilities they work for, their routes on a particular day, all just by collecting information through apps that are free in the App Store and easily accessible. And this is a really important point. This regulation applies even to anonymized information. So that is very, very different than any other privacy regulation. It's not just if it's identifiable, it can apply to de-identified, encrypted, anonymized information. And the reason is because the U.S. from a national security perspective is concerned that foreign adversaries can take publicly available information and build very, very specific profiles on individual and then leverage that for national security reasons.
Yeah, and I think there are some concerns around the use of that type of information in like influence type operations,
Yep.
right? And from a social media standpoint, like creating certain contents that's gonna target certain demographics, to try to influence them in certain ways.
It's a more sophisticated version of the concern that arose after the Ashley Madison attack.
Yeah.
Right? So you have individuals who may have sensitive national security secrets, who may be in positions of national influence, who you now have an immense amount of data on. And with Ashley Madison, it was one piece of very compromising data, but now it's much more insidious in ways. You can build quite a picture of life from even, as Kaylee said, anonymous data.
And just one more point, and not to beat a dead horse, but there are exceptions. There are a lot of them, but they're very, very limited and nuanced. So even on the face of the exceptions, it may look like it applies, but then when you dig into the examples and the commentary, it's very intentionally designed to be narrow.
One thing I wanted to follow up on was the enforcement part. There's been a lot of changes, and I imagine this happens, but I think the audience would be curious that with like a change of a new administration, like there are new people at the FTC, new people at the SEC, new people at the DOJ. How do companies like plan for that, right? Because there are these laws on the books, and if you're thinking they're not going to enforce it, like what do you do about that?
I think there is how have companies historically planned, and I think there's how are companies planning now. Because I think the shifts that we are seeing from the Biden administration to the second Trump administration are honestly significantly larger and more pronounced and disruptive than the shifts I think we've seen in prior Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat shifts. So, I think we're going from the only place where I think this is interestingly, there is an element of continuity is on big tech, right? So the Biden administration went after big tech for antitrust concerns and around safety, I'll say. And I think the Trump administration similarly has been, kind of hesitant about big tech and more aggressive on big tech for totally different reasons. And that's censorship. So that's the FTC letters from the chairman and any sort of kowtowing to Europe. So big tech, I think, is an example where they're experiencing similar enforcement pressure just from totally different motivations.
Yeah, and I think there are always these shifts, right? I mean, with any change of administration, there may be shifts in enforcement priority, but cybersecurity is an area that there's a lot of interest in on both sides. And so there may be within the scope of these agencies different enforcement priorities in terms of the nature of the way they're approaching these issues. I don't think that enforcement in this space is going away. It may look a little different than it did a few years ago, but it's certainly not going away. And even if there is sort of a shift in enforcement priorities at the federal level, certainly the states are going to pick it up. So we're not seeing any indication that state regulators are going to pull back when it comes to enforcing around privacy and cybersecurity issues. AI is another big topic that, there was conversations around a potential AI moratorium. That doesn't look like it's going to happen, but even if it did, I think you'd see the same thing happening at the state level. States are going to try to protect, state regulators are going to try to protect their constituents. So if they think that they can enforce under existing authorities in these different areas as the technology is evolving, I don't think they're going to hold back in doing that.
So I'm going to bring us over to Europe because we covered the global aspect of this, right? So, it seems like Europe historically was very strong and early on privacy regulation, but not so much on cybersecurity. But recently there's the DORA, right? Digital Operational Resiliency Act.
Resilience.
Resilience Act.
So close.
We're so close, so close. And then there's NIS2, right? As well too. So maybe you could tell us about those.
Yeah, so the Digital Operational Resilience Act targets large financial institutions, and importantly, it sounds like, oh, it's a big bank law. It's not. It targets all of the various service providers that provide IT support, big or small. And what we've seen, so DORA came into force in January, and I would say the regime, the various constituent elements of it were in place by July. And, what we're seeing is that DORA brings to the C-suite novel considerations that, in prior sort of, incident reporting discussions were not in play, right? You may have a CEO that's thinking about reputational impact, that's thinking about economic impact, but those elements were not part of the decision matrix of whether you have a legal reporting obligation. And that's what DORA brings to the fore. It brings a whole new suite of IT governance, incident reporting, and third-party risk management obligations for financial firms and flowing down to the IT service providers that they use. And what we're seeing is that, clients want toolkits, they want playbooks for how to deal with this, because there are, for you have a critical function, if you define something as a critical function and it goes down, you have 24 hours to notify. So you have sort of new players, new requirements, new thresholds, right? New thresholds that are kind of novel for companies to be considering in this context. And we're just seeing that the level of preparation required is quite substantial. And moreover, there isn't a right answer. Like, I think in the United States, it's either red or green. You either have unauthorized access to covered data or you don't. And I know that there are nuances, and I mean, Dave and I have spent many, many, many hours talking about the nuances of that question. But I think this is a whole new layer of nuance. And so what we're seeing is companies want to develop, like the same way I spoke about earlier, they want to develop some sort of compliant documentation that supports their position that they are satisfying the requirements of DORA. And so again, a whole new type of thinking is coming into play on the other side of the pond for how do we comply with these new requirements.
Yeah, and NIST, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, a large part of like our critical infrastructure is run by companies, whether in the Americas or Europe. And, I think there's this concern around national security that if there was some sort of cyber, a war, cyber event, that these companies are not prepared to defend against its attacks. And I think that's why, the lawmakers are putting these things in place. There's some sectors that are probably better off, and then there are other sectors that are probably underfunded in terms of like their ability to defend against these attacks. I mean, would you agree with that, or?
Yeah.
Completely agree. No.
Target rich, resource poor. So, I mean, in the United States, that's water, education, healthcare. Right. Big impact if they're compromised, very few resources and historical attention paid to information security.
Yeah, and I was just going to make that point about NIST too. So that's the kind of the companion framework to DORA, which doesn't apply to financial institutions, but applies to a whole lot of other critical infrastructure sectors that have been designated under the directive. And so again, this is a European directive, which makes it more challenging. We talked a little bit at the beginning about the inconsistencies in the application of all of these different requirements. That's going to be even more the case here. So with the directive, that means that all of the EU member states have to implement their own regulations implementing this directive. So that's going to create inconsistencies. It was all the member states were supposed to have done this by, I believe it was October, and only a handful had. So the European Commission came out a few months ago and said, you really need to get this done. I think Portugal came out yesterday and passed their law. So it's still in early stages, but it is a shift toward more regulation around cybersecurity, whereas traditionally in Europe we've seen more regulation around privacy. So because of the nature of it being a directive, I think time will tell exactly what this is going to look like across the member states. But one aspect that's really interesting, in addition to the incident reporting timelines, is this concept of board liability and individual liability. And I think you see this under DORA as well. And frankly, we're seeing it in the US, the shift from regulators toward trying to hold executives, board members individually liable for security failures on their watch. So that concept exists under NIST too. And so individuals can be held individually liable, but it's going to depend how that's interpreted and implemented at the member state level. But I think it's just notable in terms of the direction we've kind of seen the regulators shift toward looking at individuals.
Yeah, I can't say which company, but like we did work on a case where I think it was in Spain maybe, and like the company was trying to have a coordinated response on when they notify regulators, and the individual involved was like, nope, personal liability, I'm reporting this. I don't care what you say, and so that subsidiary did like do the notification right then and there.
Well, and I know exactly what you're talking about. In my own experience, we had a European subsidiary who reported immediately inaccurate information, unsubstantiated information, and I would bet they probably cost their sort of parent company several $100,000 in legal fees to kind of unwind and untangle the initial inaccurate notification that was provided and make some sense of it. So people sort of in the CISO seat are kind of between a rock and a hard place, and I think in the US we've seen that after Uber and SolarWinds, both of their CEOs being targeted, CISOs being targeted, and we're now seeing it in Europe as well. So now you have an added tension, right, between the desired necessity to report early and frequently to European regulators to avoid their liability, but then in the United States, those reportings will also trigger obligations on your U.S. side, so that you don't get saddled with accusations of misrepresentation and not presenting a consistent face to your customers and your business partners.
Yeah, and the intent is to try to get companies to take security more seriously. Not that they aren't, but I think from the regulators' view, they feel like companies haven't done enough. But I'm going in a little bit of a tangent, but if you're talking about the security professionals that we have available, it's already an undersaturated market. The demand far outweighs the supply, and then you're adding concern about individual liability. It definitely plays a role in terms of the supply and demand of the professionals that we have available and that are working in a space that's already a very, very hard job. Yeah. So I think it will be interesting to see kind of how that continues to play out in Europe and the U.S. As those tensions continue to pull.
Yeah, I think they feel there have been, and I say they, I mean like the legislatures, right? They feel that there have been events, and I'm trying to think about some examples. So maybe like an event like Colonial Pipeline, or what happened during the Ukraine war, where hospitals were impacted, the telecom infrastructure was impacted, that impacted their response like during the war, and they're trying to put some motivation, I think, in terms of like, are there ways to put more effort on this? Hopefully this is one of many levers that they can pull, and providing support in other ways. I do think some of these other industries are challenged from a financial standpoint. You mentioned resource standpoint in terms of just availability of people. So yeah, this shift from breach disclosure to resilience is something that is very noticeable, I think, from our standpoint.
Right, and more expectations around senior management and board members and their expertise in cyber. And so we did see this as a potential concept under the SEC cybersecurity rules. It came out under the finer rule as terms of actually requiring a cyber expert on your board, but you have to, if you're a public company, you have to disclose the expertise you do have. Europe goes further under these regulations and actually requires board members to have the requisite expertise. And I think that's because to your point, if you are managing, have oversight functions for these companies for a risk that is as serious as cyber risk management, you need to understand what those risks are and how to make decisions around them. So I don't think that shift is likely to go away.
So Kaylee, maybe I could bring you to a different part of the world, right? So we look into Asia, like what there are new laws in China, India, Australia. What are the big ones that people should be aware of?
Yeah, so we kind of touched on this in the beginning, but we're seeing a lot of movement toward notification obligations around impacts to critical infrastructure. So Australia's SOCI Act, the security, I'm going to forget the acronym, operational, I can't remember the what it stands for, but the SOCI Act, similar to what we've talked about, if there are impacts to, significant impacts to critical infrastructure services that support them, there are separate notification obligations. You're seeing this in other countries like Singapore, and then we've got the China cross-border regulate, kind of new, kind of not new. But
I mean, yeah, the China story is interesting because, I think I once heard a legal professor refer to China as a place with rule by law as opposed to rule of law. And I think that was an experience that many American companies, many who sort of I counseled on, developing procedures for dawn raids, were spooked by. And I think what we're seeing now, and the most recent development, is a series of FAQs issued in April by the Cyberspace Administration of China that I think actually tacks in the opposite direction, trying to provide some comfort to Western companies that there is regularity, there is reliability in how the cross-border data transfer regime is implemented in practice. And I think some examples of that would be something I've never seen before. China actually published statistics on, how many security assessments were conducted by the CAC and how many passed, and the majority passed. How many requests for data transfers for important data were approved and how many were not. I think that there's a clarity in the FAQs about, this is not important data unless we tell you it's important data. So trying to provide some comfort that not every data transfer in and out of China is per se covered and thus per se prohibited. And I think that's because they swung the pendulum so far in the other direction that you really had American companies. I mean, I remember sort of 5-6 years ago talking with companies, and essentially the conclusion was there was no way to comply with these rules. There was no way to effectively do it, and you were kind of operating on noblesse oblige. Like you were hoping that if you played nice, you would not be the recipient of that dawn raid. But there was no comfort that if you follow this rule and apply it practically, you're in the clear. I think they're trying to establish that Western companies can do business in China.
And we're actually seeing the inverse of that with the bulk data rule. So the requirements are extremely onerous. The security requirements are very difficult to comply with. The auditing requirements, they're very burdensome. So we're seeing a lot of companies just decide to get out of scope altogether, which may mean moving their Chinese customer support operations to Singapore. I mean, the companies are making operational decisions like that because they think that is simpler, cheaper, easier than trying to comply with the rule. And frankly, I think that is maybe part of the Department of Justice's goal with the rule. So some of these laws are having real operational impacts in terms of how companies are conducting their business.
So thank you so much for that overview. I want to leave time for one or two questions, but before we do that, if each of you could maybe take a minute, right, and cover, like, what should people be doing, right? Because I'm hearing there's not a lot of new laws that are covering like resilience. It's beyond breaches. Some of it, is confusing, and they may or may not enforce it, right? So what should companies really be doing? Like what's one or two pieces of practical advice that you would give the audience?
Practice. I think the only way to know what to do in these situations is to practice. You run tabletop exercises, you run incident reporting and disclosure exercises. It's time consuming, but I think, when the fines are what they are, especially in Europe, and when there's a risk of criminal liability, I think, practicing is the only way to see if what you have on paper, what you get from your consultant or your outside counsel in terms of a procedure is actually going to work for your organization.
I totally agree, and I think a key component of that is bringing everyone to the table. So it does not just fall on the security team to manage this, and in fact there are many other stakeholders outside of just the legal department and security teams that play a key role in this, and having those conversations early and often before something goes wrong is going to better position you to respond. But this can be all very overwhelming with all of the laws and regulations and keeping up with all of that. But I think we should all take a step back and just remember, like, the focus of this is securing your infrastructure and having a strong security program. And if you start there, that's going to make the narrative and the conversations around the reporting and any investigation much easier if that's what's driving you.
I agree with both of your points. Unfortunately, I don't get to practice. I get pulled in last minute when something's already happened. And sometimes we pull out these playbooks and it talks about breach disclosure, and it doesn't really talk about resiliency. And the people in the room aren't necessarily the right people that we need to have in the room, right? So if you got to report to CISA, like, did you have you planned on that, and did you pull the right people in? So having help people learn the hard way. I totally agree with both of your points. So we do have time for a couple questions, but before we do that, Elon, if you could pull up the slide maybe on the QR code. We do want your feedback. So if you could, take some time to provide your feedback. But we'll take questions. I think Elon has a mic if anyone wants to raise their hand.
Please don't hold against us all of the regulations. We didn't create them.
So as companies are building security operations centers across the globe, how are they handling the data collection that we're getting to get the information we need about what's attacking us and dealing with all of those regulations to make sure that we're securing that data in the proper region? Centralizing it all in the United States seems like it's not even possible with all these laws. I've got to have data for security operations centers in each region that I'm collecting it in, which makes it really difficult to correlate to make sure that I understand that there's an attack in Europe and in the United States at the same time, and it's the same person.
Right.
So how are companies dealing with that?
Data localization, what you're really bringing up are the challenge posed by data localization laws. And I will say, it's been a challenge working with, I'll just easy example with sort of many of the large consulting firms that provide threat reporting and incident response because they aggregate data in the cloud. Yep. And in some places, for some matters, that just doesn't work. Like, we need to keep that data local to in country or in region. And I would be lying if I said there was an easy answer or solution to that. I think the atomization and fragmentation of the internet and of the legal regime that governs the internet is not going to stop, unfortunately. And it's clear geopolitically why that's happening, but it's only going to make operations more costly and more challenging. I don't think there's a good answer to it.
We struggle with that on the Mandiant side because we try to keep our response 24/7. So we have people all over the world potentially accessing the data, even if it was in one place, and that's a challenge. I think we've been able to minimize some of that impact with keeping like the metadata. When you get into like privacy information, it gets really complicated. So we've been dealing with that with GDPR for some years now as well too.
Going way back to the beginning when you were talking about ransomware, options, ultimatums potentially presented by the government for, will not deal with terrorists, will not comply, will not pay. Knock on wood, we haven't had to deal with that, and I haven't had to personally deal with that yet. But I think of all the confounding variables that might be involved with, okay, it's our data, but it was because of another service or another product's issue. With that in mind, and many other things to think about, if the U.S. government were to implement a ban on such a payment system, and then what? What happens after that? Like, I've heard of issues where, or incidents where the gray hats have been willing to even come and potentially sign an NDA as long as it's a win-win-win situation. But if we were to ban that possibility, and then what happens do you see? Sorry, it's a very hypothetical there.
Well, right now we do sort of have a ban for sanctions, like sanctioned entities, right? So the U.S. Treasury has that, where if they think it's a terrorist organization, for example, you cannot pay them. So we have at least that to work with.
Tough luck. In all seriousness, I think that's another scenario where there is not going to be a good solution. You're going to, in some cases, for, I would say most likely not publicly traded companies that are less mature, less sophisticated, you're just going to drive the activity underground. I think for many in this room, that's probably not what's going to happen, but for your small, medium businesses that are looking down the barrel of pretty much like a business ending event in some cases, I think that's what's going to happen. It's going to drive the activity into the dark, which is not good for anyone in cyberspace. And I think it's going to, I think the perverse incentive, which is going to happen for sort of entities, and this is sort of what the government is thinking, those in government who want to do this, it's going to drive an immense amount of spending, I think, on cybersecurity. because the real is especially on the publicly traded, sophisticated entity side. So I do think there is a result, but it's to the point I think you're getting at, it's unfair. It's victimizing someone who is the victim of a crime again. And that's something that DOJ has for years said we are not going to do. We are not going to prosecute this absent sanctions. And I put very low odds that this actually happens, honestly.
Kaylee, I was going to ask you, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but even the Treasury rule, there's a exception process, right, where you can ask for that. Has it ever been granted? Like, has anyone ever asked and been granted?
I haven't seen that.
I'm not aware.
I don't. Yeah.
It's essentially a license, right? So you can get licenses to deal with sanctioned parties. I am not aware of anyone ever requesting a license to pay a ransom to a designated entity.
Yeah.
But
And never getting it approved.
yeah,
Well, that two pieces have to happen.
but I agree. I think it's going to be really hard to get agreement on that and the impacts of that. I mean, it's kind of similar to we talk with executives all the time, say I would never pay a ransom, and then when they're faced with it, sometimes the calculus is a little different.
I've seen exceptions for the disclosure, though.
Right.
For like national
SEC.
security reasons. So, okay. Well, I guess with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. We'll be here for a little bit.